They told me I was a biological error, a stain on a bloodline made of gold and sunlight. For 20 years, I was the pack's ghost, a runt waiting for a grave. Then came the eclipse, and the brother who pushed me into the abyss. Chapter 1. The Bottom of the Den. The copper tang of old blood filled Kaelen's nose, but it wasn't his own. Not yet. He was on his knees, scrubbing the cold stone of the ritual altar, while the silver fang pack roared with laughter in the hall above. Every time he pushed the brush, his thin arms shook like dry twigs in a storm. He was the broken Omega, the runt they kept around just to have something to kick. Deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't part of this pack. He was their janitor, their punching bag, and their future ghost. "Scrub harder, runt!" a voice boomed, followed by a heavy boot connecting with Kaelen's ribs. He curled into a ball as he hit the floor. The stone felt like ice against his cheek. It was Jax, one of the lower-tier sentries, a man who smelled like sour sweat and cheap ale. Jax didn't hate Kaelen for any reason other than the fact that Kaelen was small. Because Kaelen was an Omega with no bite, he was the perfect target for a bully who wanted to feel like a king. Kaelen didn't fight back. Instead, he squeezed his eyes shut and waited for the next blow. Moments later, Jax leaned down, grabbing a handful of Kaelen's matted hair. "You're lucky we're keeping you alive for the eclipse. Pure blood needs a sacrifice, and you're just the right amount of trash to throw away." Kaelen's breath caught. He wanted to scream, to growl, to tear Jax's throat out. But his wolf was a silent, shivering thing inside him. He felt so small that he wondered if he was even there at all. In that moment, he realized that his invisibility was his only shield, a hollow vacuum he hid in so the world couldn't see how much he was hurting. After that, the sentries finally grew bored and kicked him one last time before heading back to the feast. Kaelen stayed on the floor, listening to the muffled drums and the howling joy of the coronation celebration. To make things worse, the scent of roasting deer drifted down, mocking his empty stomach. He was a biological error, a stain on the pure bloodline of the Silver Fangs. As the silence stretched, a shadow fell over the altar. It was Elder Silas, a wolf so old his skin looked like wrinkled parchment. The old man didn't offer a hand. He just stared at the moon through the high barred window. "The moon is turning red, boy," Silas whispered, his voice like dry leaves skittering on a grave. "In the span of a breath, the sky will bleed. It's time for the culling." Kaelen felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold floor. The culling was a legend, a bedtime story meant to scare cubs, but the way Silas said it made Kaelen's blood turn to lead. His heart skipped as he looked up at the moon, which was already beginning to glow with a sickly, bruised light. Eventually, he dragged himself to his feet, his bones aching with every movement. He had to finish cleaning. If the altar wasn't spotless for Fenris's big day, the punishment would be far worse than a few broken ribs. But as he looked at the stone, he realized no matter how hard he scrubbed, the stains of the past wouldn't go away. The broken Omega was already marked for the abyss. Chapter 2. The Ghost of Friendship. The celebration was a dull roar behind the heavy oak doors of the private chambers. Kaelen stood in the shadows, his head bowed, waiting like a servant. Soon after, the door creaked open, and Fenris stepped inside. He was the Golden Sun, a man who looked like he was carved from sunlight and muscle. His fur, even in human form, seemed to shimmer with the promise of the solar flare blessing. "Kael," Fenris said, his voice smooth and deep. The moment their eyes locked, Kaelen felt a ghost of a memory. They used to run together as cubs. They used to share dreams of leading the pack together. But then, Kaelen hadn't shifted properly, and Fenris had become the pack's god. Now, the space between them burned with everything that hadn't been said in 5 years. Without a word, Fenris walked to the table and tossed a thick slab of venison toward Kaelen. It skidded across the wood, landing near the edge. Fenris didn't look at him while he did it. In fact, he looked everywhere but at Kaelen's face. It was the way someone fed a stray dog they planned to put down. "Eat," Fenris commanded. You look like a skeleton. Kaelen's stomach growled, but he didn't move. Why are you doing this, Fenris? You know what the elders are saying. You know what happens at the eclipse. Fenris finally looked at him, but his eyes were cold, distant. It's for the pack, Kael. We have to be pure. The solar flare won't come to a bloodline that is diluted by weakness. That's why it hurt so much. It wasn't just the pack. It was his best friend. Fenris was choosing a crown over a brother. Still, Kaelen stepped forward and took a small bite of the meat. It tasted like ash. He was seeking a flicker of the bond they once had, but all he found was a wall of gold and pride. I wish you were stronger, Kyle, Fenris whispered, his hand hovering over Kaelen's shoulder, but never quite touching him. I wish you were something I could save. But for what's coming, you have to play your part. What followed was a heavy, suffocating silence. Kaelen realized that Fenris wasn't mourning him. He was justifying him. To Fenris, Kaelen's death was just a price to be paid for greatness. Kaelen felt a surge of fury, but he choked it down. He was a runt. Runts didn't get to be angry. Get some rest, Fenris said, turning his back. The ritual begins at midnight. As the wind shifted outside, Kaelen felt the temperature drop. He left the room without another word, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. He didn't know what scared him more, the thought of dying, or the fact that the person he loved most in the world was the one who would lead him to the edge. Chapter 3. The selection midnight arrived with a sky the color of a fresh wound. The entire Silver Fang pack gathered at the high seat, their eyes reflecting the eerie red glow of the eclipsed moon. Kaelen stood in the center of a circle of warriors, his hands bound with silver-threaded rope that made his skin itch and burn. Beneath the moonlight, the pack looked like a sea of monsters, their teeth bared in anticipation. The Alpha, Fenris's father, stepped onto the high ledge. The moon demands purity, he roared. To ensure our new Alpha carries the sun in his veins, we must cast out the shadow. Every eye turned toward Kaelen. Just like that, his life was reduced to a math problem. 1 runt for 1,000 warriors. It was a fair trade in their eyes. Kaelen looked for Fenris in the crowd, hoping for one last sign of mercy. But Fenris stood at his father's side, his face a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Kaelen Thorne! The Alpha shouted. By the law of the Silver Fang, you are found wanting. You are the rot in our bones. You are the sacrifice for the Shadow Ridge. Panic flared in Kaelen's chest. He tried to pull at the ropes, but they only bit deeper. He looked at the faces of his aunts, his cousins, the people who had watched him grow up. They weren't looking at him with hatred. In fact, they were looking at him with a terrifying religious indifference. He wasn't a person to them anymore. He was a ritual object. He was a piece of trash being walked to the bin. No, Kaelen gasped, his voice trembling. Please, I can work. I can stay in the dens. You don't have to do this. Rather than answering, 2 guards grabbed his arms and began dragging him toward the mountain path that led to the ridge. The pack followed in a silent, grim procession. With every heartbeat, the Shadow Ridge grew closer. A literal crack in the world that swallowed light and never gave it back. Deep down, Kaelen knew the truth now. There was no mercy in this world for the small. There was only the hunger of the strong. As they reached the precipice, the air thickened with the smell of old magic and decay. The ridge roared with a silence that was louder than any howl. Wait, Fenris said, stepping forward as they reached the edge. For a second, Kaelen's heart leaped. He's going to stop it, he thought. He's going to save me. But Fenris only took the ceremonial dagger from his father. He walked toward Kaelen, the red moonlight catching the edge of the blade. Kaelen's breath caught as Fenris leaned in close, his scent of pine and cedar filling Kaelen's senses one last time. Don't fight it, Kael, Fenris whispered into his ear. If you go quietly, it will be over faster. As the truth unraveled, Kaelen realized there was no escape. Between them, something cracked, the last chord of Kaelen's humanity. He didn't beg anymore. Instead, he looked into the black maw of the ridge. If the world had no place for him, maybe the darkness would. Without thinking, Kaelen stopped shaking. A cold, hollow peace began to settle over him. If he was nothing, then let him be the nothing that swallowed them all. He stood at the very brink of the world, a broken omega waiting for the push that would change everything. Chapter 4. The Long Walk. The edge of the Shadow Ridge felt like the end of the universe. Below Kaelen's trembling boots, the abyss breathed, a slow, rhythmic pulse of cold air that smelled like wet earth and ancient, forgotten things. Without warning, the Alpha shoved Kaelen toward the very lip of the cliff. The pack stood in a semicircle, their eyes glowing like embers in the dying red light of the eclipse. They were waiting for the moment the bloodline would be purified by his disappearance. "Do it, Fenris," the Alpha commanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated in Kaelen's marrow. Moments later, Fenris stepped into the moonlight. He looked like a god of war, but his hand was shaking as he gripped the ceremonial dagger. Between them, something cracked. The last shred of the boy Kaelen used to call brother. No matter how hard he tried, Kaelen couldn't find a trace of mercy in Fenris's golden eyes. "I'm sorry, Kael," Fenris whispered, though the words were hollow, floating away into the hungry wind. Before either could speak, Fenris didn't use the knife. Instead, he reached out and placed a heavy palm on Kaelen's chest. In that moment, the world narrowed to the heat of that hand and the freezing void at Kaelen's back. Fenris leaned in, his face a mask of grief and ambition, and gave a single violent shove. Kaelen's world tilted. He fell backward, the air rushing past his ears like 1,000 screaming voices. What followed was the sensation of being erased. As he tumbled into the dark, the faces of the pack vanished, replaced by a sky that was being swallowed by a black maw. He was the broken Omega, and he was finally fulfilling his purpose. He was being thrown away. Despite that, a spark of pure, unadulterated fury ignited in his gut. It wasn't the fall that hurt. It was the realization that he was the only one who had ever truly been loyal. By the time the light of the moon became a pinprick above him, Kaelen stopped screaming. He realized that the darkness wasn't just empty space. In fact, it felt thick like water made of ink. Just like that, the gravity changed, and the ordinary world was gone. Chapter 5. The descent time stood still as Kaelen drifted through the heavy mist of the ridge. He wasn't hitting rocks, and he wasn't dying. Rather, he was being dismantled. His skin felt like it was peeling away, not with pain, but with a strange, numbing static. Every heartbeat sent a ripple of purple light through his veins. He was a biological error being corrected by the very physics of the abyss. "Who am I?" He tried to gasp, but the words were swallowed by the pressure. Soon after, his body slammed into something that wasn't ground, but a thickness in the air. It felt like hitting a wall of cold velvet. He tumbled onto a ledge of jagged obsidian glass that sang with a low, humming frequency. To make things worse, the silver-threaded ropes on his wrists began to glow and melt, searing his skin before turning into black ash. As the silence roared, Kaelen looked at his hands. They weren't pink and bruised anymore. Instead, they were pale, almost translucent, with veins that pulsed with a dark, liquid shadow. Deep down, he knew the truth. He was dissolving. He was becoming the very nothingness they had thrown him into. Moments later, a sound echoed from the depths, a clicking, grinding noise like 1,000 stone teeth gnashing together. Kaelen's instincts surged, but he had no wolf to answer the call. His wolf was dead, drowned in the dark. Still, a new power was beginning to stir in the hollow space where his soul used to be. It was a cold, hungry thing that didn't want to run. It wanted to consume. In the span of a breath, the eyes opened. Thousands of them, glowing with a pale, sickly green light, blinked in the walls of the canyon. These weren't animals. These were the echoes. the remnants of every impurity the silver fangs had sacrificed over the centuries. They were hungry, and they smelled the last of his human blood. Kaelen scrambled backward, his fingers catching on the obsidian glass. He was terrified, yet a part of him felt a sick sense of belonging. He was among his own kind now. He was the runt of the graveyard. But as the first echo lunged, a jagged shadow that looked like a wolf made of smoke, Kaelen didn't close his eyes. Rather, he felt a scream building in his throat that wasn't a sound at all. Chapter 6. The First Breath of Nothing. The echo lunged, its smoke claws inches from Kaelen's throat. Without thinking, Kaelen threw his hands up to shield his face. Instead of feeling teeth, he felt a vacuum. A burst of absolute silence erupted from his palms, and the echo simply vanished. It didn't die. It was deleted. "What was that?" Kaelen whispered, his voice trembling like a leaf. As if fate demanded it, the other echoes hissed and drew back. They sensed the change. Kaelen wasn't just a sacrifice anymore. He was a breach in reality. Because of that, the air around him began to warp, bending the light of the glowing green eyes until they were snuffed out. He felt it, clear as day, a connection to a power that didn't come from the moon or the sun. That's why he didn't run when the shadows began to coalesce into a tall, feminine shape. Out of the darkness stepped a girl with hair as white as bone and eyes that held no pupils. She wore rags that looked like they were woven from spider silk and ash. This was Lyra, the ghost of the ridge, and the only person who hadn't tried to kill him yet. "You're a loud one, Runt," she said, her voice a dry rasp that echoed in his skull. "Most people die quietly here, but you're making the gods wake up." Kaelen tried to stand, but his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. "Who are you? Did they throw you away too?" Lyra laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "I was the first thing they forgot, but you're the last thing they'll ever see." She stepped closer, her scent not of wolf, but of ozone and old stone. "The ridge is a training ground, boy. The forgotten deities are bored, and you look like a very interesting toy." Truth be told, Kaelen wanted to scream. He wanted to go home. But as he looked at Lyra, he realized he had no home to go back to. He was a dead man walking. So, instead of crying, he reached out his hand. His soul answered the darkness, and the obsidian ledge beneath them began to glow with a dark, terrifying purple light. "Teach me," Kaelen commanded, his voice no longer a runt's whimper, but a cold, hard promise. In that moment, everything changed. He wasn't Kaelen the Omega anymore. Between one breath and the next, he became a student of the void. As the wind shifted, carrying the distant, muffled howls of the pack far above, Kaelen felt a growl rise in his throat. It wasn't a wolf's growl. It was the sound of a world beginning to end. Chapter 7. The Remnants Camp. The training grounds of the Shadow Ridge felt like a physical weight pressing against Kaelen's lungs, yet he followed Lyra deeper into the shifting purple haze. Soon after, they reached a jagged overhang where the wind didn't just howl, it whispered the names of the dead. Lyra knelt by a small flickering fire that burned with a cold violet flame, its heat non-existent, but its light sharp enough to cut through the oppressive gloom. "Sit," Lyra commanded, her voice a dry rasp that seemed to vibrate in Kaelen's very marrow. Before she could move, she reached into a leather pouch and pulled out a handful of shimmering silver-gray ash. Without warning, she pressed the grit into the raw, silver-burned flesh of Kaelen's wrists. A hiss of steam escaped his skin as the void ash began to knit his cells back together. But it didn't feel like healing. Rather, it felt like his humanity was being replaced by something cold and eternal. "What are you doing to me?" Kaelen gasped, his voice trembling as he watched his veins turn a bruised obsidian black. Lyra didn't look up, her bone-white hair falling over her face like a shroud. "I'm making you solid, Runt. In this place, If you don't have a soul made of iron, the gravity will turn you into a puddle of ink. Because of that, Kaelen looked at his hands and realized with a jolt of terror that he had no scent, no musk of a wolf, no salt of sweat, nothing. He was a ghost now, a biological vacuum that the world above could never track. It was the ultimate defense for a man who had spent his life being hunted. Still, the silence inside his chest where his wolf used to howl felt like a wound that would never close. "The gods aren't dead," Lyra whispered, her sightless eyes finally meeting his. "They're just hungry for someone who can't be broken. And you look like a very interesting meal." What followed was a heavy, suffocating silence that lasted for what felt like hours. Kaelen realized that he was no longer a part of the natural cycle of the pack. He was an anomaly. As the violet fire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the canyon walls, he felt his pulse begin to sync with the rhythmic thrum of the ridge. Chapter 8. The Trial of Echoes. Come morning, or whatever passed for light in the abyss, Lyra led Kaelen to a massive, crumbling monolith that pulsed with a rhythmic, heartbeat-like thud. Without thinking, Kaelen stepped toward it, but the air suddenly curdled. In that moment, a dozen echoes materialized from the stones, their forms jagged and distorted, looking like the twisted nightmares of the wolves who had died before him. "Kill them, or let them eat your memories," Lyra said, leaning casually against a pillar of obsidian. Kaelen's heart skipped as the lead echo, a massive beast with 3 heads and eyes of liquid fire, lunged at his throat. His body moved on instinct, but he had no claws to extend and no fangs to bear. Instead of a wolf's roar, he felt a cold, hollow pressure building in the back of his throat. Deep down, he knew the truth. He didn't need to fight them. He needed to unmake them. "Stop," Kaelen whispered, but the word didn't come out as a sound. Rather, it was a ripple of absolute silence that expanded from his lips like a shockwave. The lead echo froze mid-air, its form shattering into 1,000 glass-like shards before dissolving into nothingness. Not only that, but the other echoes began to wail, a soundless scream that echoed in Kaelen's mind as they were pulled into the vacuum he had created. "That's the first syllable of the liturgy," Lyra remarked, her voice holding a hint of genuine surprise. "You just silenced an ancient hunger. Most take years to find that breath." As the echo faded, Kaelen looked at his palms, which were now glowing with a faint, ghostly violet light. He felt a surge of cold, dark curiosity that replaced his fear. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was adapting. Yet, as the silence roared around him, he wondered if he was losing the very thing that made him human. Chapter 9. The Hunter Hunted. The deeper they went into the ridge, the more the environment itself seemed to turn against them. Moments later, the ground beneath Kaelen's feet turned to liquid shadow, trying to pull him under. From the darkness emerged a void beast, a creature of bone and smoke that served as the hound for the forgotten deities. It was twice the size of a grizzly, and its breath smelled like the vacuum of space. "Don't run," Lyra warned, her voice sharp as a blade. "It feeds on the motion of your fear." Instead of fleeing, Kaelen stood his ground, his chest aching with the effort to remain still. As if pulled by a string, the beast lunged, its massive jaws clamping down on Kaelen's shoulder. Blood sprayed, dark and thick, but Kaelen didn't scream. Because of his indomitable endurance, he simply watched the beast, his eyes turning a solid, midnight purple. "You are nothing," Kaelen hissed, grabbing the beast's snout with his bare, blackened hands. Just like that, the beast's teeth began to crumble into gray dust. Its solid bone turned to smoke, and its eyes flickered out like candles in a gale. Kaelen felt the creature's power flowing into him, filling the hollow cracks in his soul with a cold, terrifying strength. In the quiet that followed, the beast didn't just die. It was erased from existence, leaving only a faint scent of ozone behind. "In fact, you might just be the one," Lyra murmured, stepping out from the shadows. The tension broke, and Kaelen fell to his knees, gasping for air that felt like ice in his throat. He looked up at the high, jagged cliffs that hid the world of the Silver Fangs. He could almost feel Fenris's warmth far above, a sun that he was destined to snuff out. More importantly, he realized that the shadows weren't attacking him anymore. They were bowing. As the wind shifted, carrying the distant, muffled howl of a wolf from the surface, Kaelen felt a cold smile touch his lips. He was the runt of the graveyard no longer. Between one breath and the next, he had become the master of the dark. And he knew, with every heartbeat, that the Silver Fangs had no idea what was coming back for them. Chapter 10. The Scrying Pool. The air in the deep cavern was so thick it felt like breathing crushed velvet. Kaelen stood before a basin of obsidian, its surface filled with a liquid that didn't reflect his face, but rather the world he had been forced to leave behind. Soon after, he dipped his blackened fingers into the pool, and the ripples began to knit together into an image of the Silver Fang high seat. "Look at them," Lyra whispered, her breath a cold draft against his neck. "While you were drowning in the dark, they were building a monument to your death." In that moment, Kaelen saw the grand hall draped in banners of gold and crimson. The pack was feasting, their bellies full of the very meat he used to dream of. Because of that, a jagged spike of fury pierced his hollow chest. He saw his cousins laughing and his aunts toasted to a purified future. To make things worse, the prosperity of the pack seemed to shine with a sickening, artificial light. "They look happy," Kaelen rasped, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "They look relieved." Still, his gaze drifted to the center of the hall. There sat Fenris, draped in the pelt of a great bear, his golden hair glowing under the torches. What followed was a sight that made Kaelen's blood turn to liquid nitrogen. Fenris was wearing a silver medallion, the Thorne family crest. It was the only thing Kaelen's father had left him, a trophy now hanging from the neck of a traitor. "He didn't just take your life, Kael," Lyra murmured, her eyes fixed on the pool. "He took your name and used it to pave his way to the throne." As the silence roared, Kaelen felt the void inside him pulse in sync with his rage. He realized that his sacrifice hadn't been a sacred necessity. It had been a convenient lie. The Silver Fangs weren't stronger because he was gone. They were simply more comfortable in their cruelty. Deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't a ghost watching from afar. He was a predator waiting for the sun to set. Chapter 11. The Heir's Truth. The image in the pool shifted, blurring into a memory of a younger Lyra being dragged toward the same ridge that had claimed Kaelen. Without warning, Lyra reached out and shattered the surface of the water with a single sharp blow. The ripples turned into jagged shards of ice before melting back into the black ink of the basin. "You aren't the only one they deemed defective, Kaelen," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "I was the Alpha's firstborn, the rightful heir to the high seat." Kaelen's heart skipped. He looked at her white hair and the way the shadows clung to her like a second skin. "Then why are you here? Why didn't they crown you?" Rather than answering immediately, Lyra pulled back the collar of her tunic, revealing a throat that bore no scent glands, the mark of a ghost wolf. "I was born without a scent. To the pack, a wolf who cannot be smelled is a wolf who does not exist. They called it a curse. In fact, they used my impurity as the excuse for Fenris's father to stage his coup and seize the bloodline." In the span of a breath, Kaelen understood the scope of the rot. The pure-blood ideology wasn't just a tradition. It was a political weapon used to prune the family tree of anyone who didn't fit the mold. Not only that, but he and Lyra were two sides of the same coin, the discarded remnants of a broken system. "They wanted a sacrifice," Kaelen said, his eyes glowing with a solid midnight purple. "But they're going to get a revolution. Maybe it was fate that had brought them together in the dark." As the wind shifted through the cavern, carrying the damp smell of the abyss, Kaelen felt a new goal solidify in his mind. He wasn't just fighting for his own revenge anymore. He was fighting for every runt and ghost that had ever been crushed by the weight of a gold-plated lie. Chapter 12. The solar war moments later. A flare of blinding light erupted from the scrying pool, even though Lyra hadn't touched it. The deities of the ridge were forcing a new vision into Kaelen's mind, a warning of the world above. He saw the borders of the Silver Fang territory, but the forests were no longer green. They were black and charred. "What is he doing?" Kaelen gasped, shielding his eyes from the glare. Through the light, he saw Fenris standing on a hill, his arms raised as the solar flare blessing erupted from his skin. It wasn't a gentle sun. It was a hungry, destructive heat. Between one breath and the next, Fenris unleashed a wave of fire onto a neighboring village of lesser wolves, those who didn't meet his standards of purity. "He's building his empire," Lyra hissed, her face pale with horror. "He's using the light to burn everything that isn't perfect." What followed was a scream that Kaelen could feel in his own soul, the cries of pups and elders as the golden sun incinerated their homes. Kaelen's guilt surged, a hot iron in his chest. Because he had allowed himself to be pushed into the ridge, he had left the world to a monster. He had let his best friend become a god of ash. "The deities are offering you a choice, Kaelen," a voice echoed, seemingly from the very walls of the ridge. The air thickened as three massive shadows materialized behind him, the forgotten deities. They didn't have faces, only voids where features should be. As the silence stretched, they held out a single glowing rune of absolute blackness. It was the nullification word, the ultimate syllable of the liturgy that could silence even the sun. "Take it," the deities whispered in unison. "But know that once you speak it, your heart will never beat with human warmth again. You will be the vacuum that swallows the light." Without thinking, Kaelen reached out. His soul answered the call of the dark, and his fingers closed around the rune. As fire bloomed beneath his skin, he looked up toward the ceiling of the abyss. He was going back, not as a wolf, but as the eclipse itself, and he would make sure that Fenris Thorne never saw the sun again. Chapter 13. The Altar of Silence. The air in the deepest sanctum of the Shadow Ridge didn't just feel cold. It felt absent. Kaelen stood before the three faceless deities, his hand outstretched toward the nullification word. It was a jagged rift of pure obsidian light that hovered in the air, pulsing like a dying star. Soon after, his fingers brushed the surface of the rune, and the world simply stopped. The sound of his own breathing vanished, replaced by a rhythmic, mechanical thrum that vibrated in his teeth. "Accept the weight," the deities whispered, their voices 1,000 echoes in a single breath. Without warning, the rune dissolved into Kaelen's skin. It didn't burn like the silver ropes had. Rather, it felt like a wave of liquid nitrogen was being poured into his veins. His heart gave one last frantic kick against his ribs before it went still. In that moment, Kaelen felt the last of his human warmth bleed out of him, replaced by a cold, divine void. He wasn't breathing because he needed to anymore. He was breathing because the void demanded a vessel. "I can't feel it," Kaelen rasped, his voice now carrying a strange, metallic distortion. "I can't feel my heart." Lyra stepped forward, her white hair swaying in the supernatural draft. She reached out to touch his cheek, but her hand recoiled as if she'd been bitten by a frost. Even so, her eyes remained fixed on his. To make things worse, the space between them was no longer filled with a bond of shared trauma. It was a chasm of absolute silence. Kaelen looked at her, and while he remembered that he should love her, the feeling was like a photograph from a dream, distant and fading. "The price is paid," Lyra murmured, her voice trembling. "You are the vacuum now, Kaelen. You are the anti-alpha." What followed was a terrifying realization. He was no longer a man who had been discarded. He was the tool of a cosmic correction. He felt coldly divine, a predator designed by the abyss to eat the sun. Because of that, his mission felt less like a choice and more like a law of nature. He looked up at the jagged ceiling of the ridge, and for the first time, he didn't see a grave. He saw a gateway. Chapter 14. Breaking the Surface. The journey out of the abyss was a blur of violence and shadow. Kaelen and Lyra moved like twin blurs of ink against the gray stone of the mountain. Soon after, they reached the Barrier of the Living, a shimmering wall of light that the Silver Fang elders had reinforced for centuries to keep the ridge contained. It was the same light that had blinded Kaelen on the night of the sacrifice. "We can't get through," Lyra warned, shielding her eyes. "This is the Alpha's seal. It's powered by the blood of the lineage." Instead of hesitating, Kaelen stepped directly into the white glare. He didn't use a fist or a claw. Rather, he simply looked at the barrier and thought of the word the deities had given him. In the span of a breath, he spoke a single, low syllable. Void. Just like that, the light didn't shatter. It was simply erased. A massive, jagged hole appeared in the seal, the edges turning to black soot before crumbling away. "By the time they realize we're out, we'll be at their gates," Kaelen said, his voice as flat as a grave marker. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and fresh grass from the forest above, Kaelen's body moved on instinct. He stepped through the breach and felt the sun for the first time in months. But the sun felt like an enemy, a hot, prying eye that wanted to expose his secrets. More importantly, he saw the 2 sentries guarding the mountain pass. They were elite warriors of the Solar Guard, their armor gleaming with the reflection of Fenris's power. "Intruders!" one of them roared, shifting into a massive golden-furred wolf. Before the guard could finish his lunge, Kaelen was there. He didn't shift. He didn't growl. Instead, he grabbed the wolf's throat, and the nullification word pulsed in his palm. The sentry didn't bleed. He simply turned gray, his power sucked out of him as if he were a punctured lung. The wolf collapsed, not dead but catatonic, a husk that had forgotten how to be a wolf. Chapter 15. The Parting Fog. They moved through the Silver Fang woods like a plague of silence. Every step he took felt heavier, more certain. Yet, as they approached the high seat, the air began to thicken with a gold-tinted fog, a sensory trap laid by Fenris to catch anything that didn't belong to his pure line. Without thinking, Lyra stepped into a pocket of the mist, and her scentless nature backfired. The fog reacted to the hole in the air, wrapping around her ankles like burning wire. "Kaelen!" she cried out, her voice muffled by the thick, shimmering cloud. From the trees, the Solar Guard descended. They were led by Jax, the bully who had kicked Kaelen in the den. Jax looked bigger now, his muscles swollen with the borrowed light of Fenris's rain. He didn't recognize Kaelen through the shadow mask of the void, but he knew an enemy when he saw one. "Take the female," Jax barked. "The Alpha wants to know how a ghost returned to the forest." Kaelen's thoughts spun. If he used the nullification word now, he would reveal his presence to Fenris before the coronation. The entire plan would be ruined, and his chance to save the world would vanish. On the other hand, Lyra was being dragged away, her white hair disappearing into the golden mist. He stood in the shadows, his blackened fingers twitching with the urge to erase every wolf in the clearing. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move. Deep down, he knew the truth. He had to stay hidden to maintain the surprise. He had committed to being a vacuum, and a vacuum felt nothing. Still, as Lyra's scream cut through the forest and then abruptly stopped, Kaelen felt a phantom ache in his chest, a ghost of the heart that had stopped beating. He watched from the shadows as they dragged his only ally toward the high seat. As the silence roared around him, Kaelen didn't move. He stayed in the shadows, his eyes glowing a terrifying solid purple. He had chosen the path of no return. He had become the anti-alpha, but at the cost of the only person who saw him as more than a weapon. With every heartbeat he didn't have, he promised the dark that he would get her back, and he would make the Silver Fangs pay for every inch of ground they had taken. Chapter 16. The Silent City. The high seat of the Silver Fangs had become a monument of blinding gold, but to Kaelen it looked like a gilded tomb. He drifted through the outer village in a cloak of woven shadows, his presence a literal hole in the world that the villagers simply couldn't see. Soon after, he reached the central square, where a massive statue of Fenris stood, carved from sun-bleached marble. The air was thick with the scent of roasting meat and expensive incense. Yet beneath the perfume, Kaelen smelled the rot of a dying culture. "Praise the golden sun!" a shopkeeper cried, tossing flower petals onto the cobblestones. "He has purged the weak. He has made us pure." Kaelen's chest ached, a phantom pain where his heart used to beat. He watched as a mother pulled her child away from a small limping Omega who was begging for scraps near the gutter. Because of Fenris's laws, the unfit were no longer even considered wolves. They were pests. In fact, the crowd cheered when a solar guard kicked the beggar into the mud, laughing as the poor soul scrambled away. "They love him," Kaelen rasped, his voice a dry vibration in the air. "They actually love the monster." What followed was a crushing sense of isolation that felt heavier than the ridge's gravity. He had returned to save these people, but as he looked into their eyes, he saw only a reflected arrogance. Not only that, but he realized he was more void than man now. He was a ghost haunting a city that had already forgotten his name. Still, he pressed on toward the high seat, his eyes glowing with a solid midnight purple that flickered with every cheer of the crowd. "I am a monster among men," he whispered, his shadow stretching unnaturally long against the white stone. Deep down, he knew the truth. His plan to rally the lesser wolves was failing before it began because they had been brainwashed to hate themselves. He stood in the center of the cheering throng, a vacuum of silence in a sea of noise. Just like that, his resolve wavered, and for the first time since the descent, Kaelen felt the terrifying weight of being truly alone. Chapter 17. The betrayal of self Kaelen reached the subterranean tunnels beneath the high seat, his blackened fingers tracing the damp stone. He was searching for Lyra's scent, or rather the void of her scent, but the air here was saturated with the solar noise of 1,000 aggressive warriors. Every heartbeat he didn't have seemed to mock him. Without warning, he tried to reach out with his mind, to pulse the liturgy of the void and find her cell. "Where are you, Lyra?" he groaned, closing his eyes to focus. Instead of a clear vision, he was hit by a wave of collective bloodlust from the pack above. The noise of their shared hatred for the impure acted like a jagged blade, short-circuiting his connection to the dark. As the silence roared in his ears, Kaelen fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head. His power flickered like a dying candle, and for a terrifying moment, the shadows around him retreated, exposing his pale, translucent skin to the torchlight. "No, not now," he gasped, his voice trembling. To make things worse, he stumbled into a small, forgotten alcove, the very spot where he used to hide as a cub. On the floor lay a rusted iron bowl, and on the wall the faint, dried stains of his own sacrificial blood from a beating he'd taken years ago. In the span of a breath, Kaelen's confidence shattered. He wasn't the master of the dark. He was still just the broken Omega hiding in a hole. "Maybe it was fate," he whispered, his fingers touching the old bloodstains. "Maybe I was always meant to be nothing." By the time he regained his breath, he realized he had lost his connection to the forgotten deities. The void had abandoned him because he had allowed human fear to enter the vacuum. He felt defeated, a hollow shell with no purpose and no ally. What followed was a quiet, cold resignation that felt far worse than the fall into the ridge. Chapter 18. The Dark Night of the Soul. The coronation bells began to toll, their bronze voices echoing through the tunnels like the heartbeat of a giant. Kaelen didn't move. He sat in the filth of his old hovel, his head resting against the cold stone. He had reached his lowest point. He had the power of a god, but the soul of a victim, and the two were tearing him apart. "She's going to die because of me," Kaelen said, his thoughts spinning in a dark vortex. He confronted the ugly truth he had been hiding from. He hadn't taken the nullification word to save the world. Rather, He had taken it because he wanted to see the look on Fenris's face when he took everything away. He wanted revenge, not justice. Because of that, the void was rejecting him. He looked at his hands, which were turning back to a sickly, human gray, and he realized he was becoming the very runt the pack had despised. "Is this it?" he asked the empty air. "Is this the end of the legend?" As the sky darkened outside, casting the world into a deep, bruised twilight, Kaelen felt a single tear track down his cheek. It was the last bit of human warmth he had left. Even so, he didn't wipe it away. He sat in the darkness, waiting for the solar guard to find him and finish what they started on the cliff. The goal seemed impossible, the enemy was too bright and he was too hollow. "Kaelen," a voice whispered in the wind. It wasn't a power, and it wasn't a deity. It was the memory of Lyra's voice from the ridge, the way she had told him that he was the only one who couldn't be broken. Kaelen held the alpha's throat, his fingers cold as the abyss. Still, he didn't squeeze. He looked at the warriors, the elders, and the bullies, and he simply let go. "I am not your sacrifice anymore," Kaelen declared, his voice echoing in the sudden, holy stillness. "And you are no longer my masters." Chapter 23. Falling Action. Part 1. The pure blood myth shattered along with Fenris's pride. As the sky darkened to a natural, peaceful twilight, the common wolves began to stand up, their eyes no longer fixed on the high seat but on each other. Fenris was led away in silence, his destination the very ridge he had used as a trash bin. He wasn't being killed. He was being exiled to the silence he had forced upon Kaelen. "He's gone," Lyra whispered, stepping out from the shadows of the pillars. The pack turned toward her, and for the first time, they didn't see a ghost. They saw the scentless grace of a leader who had survived the impossible. Because of that, a low, respectful rumble began in the throats of the elders. They remembered her lineage, and they saw the way the shadows bowed to her. She was the alpha the Silver Fangs had actually needed, a wolf who understood that true strength wasn't found in the sun, but in the survival of the dark. "The throne is yours, Lyra," Kaelen said, his voice losing its metallic edge and returning to something human. What followed was a slow, rhythmic bowing of heads. One by one, the warriors who had once kicked Kaelen in the mud lowered their gaze to the girl with bone-white hair. The hierarchy wasn't just crumbling. It was being rebuilt on a foundation of reality rather than light. Kaelen watched from the periphery, his translucent skin beginning to regain a flush of life as the void settled into a quiet, protective hum within his soul. Chapter 24. Falling Action. Part 2. Come morning, the sun rose over a different forest. Kaelen and Lyra stood on the balcony of the high seat, watching as the villagers shared bread with the Omegas they had once shunned. The golden banners had been torn down, replaced by simple, honest stone. Lyra turned to Kaelen, her hand finding his. This time, he didn't feel like frost. He felt like a man who had finally come home. "The pack wants you to lead with me, Kaelen," she said, her sightless eyes warm and wondering. Instead of answering immediately, Kaelen looked down at his hands. They were no longer smoke. They were flesh and bone, scarred, but solid. "I'm not a king, Lyra. I'm the shadow that guards the gate." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "You are the alpha. I am just the man who loves you." In that moment, everything changed. The pressure of the world's expectations vanished, leaving only the two of them in the quiet of the dawn. Kaelen felt a peace he hadn't known since he was a cub. He had found his value, not in his disappearance, but in his presence. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a long, quiet winter, he realized the broken Omega was finally whole. Epilogue. Scene: Kaelen stood alone at the edge of the Shadow Ridge. It was no longer a place of fear or a grave for the unwanted. Rather, it had become a place of pilgrimage. He looked down into the violet mist, and for a second he saw the ancient, faceless deities staring back. He didn't feel the need to jump. Instead, he reached out and spoke a new word. Not a nullification, but a welcome. "Come home," he whispered. The darkness smiled back, a low, rhythmic thrum of approval that vibrated in his boots. He turned and walked away from the abyss, toward the lights of the village where Lyra was waiting. He was the void-born Alpha, the man who had swallowed the sun to save the world, and as he walked, his soul answered the silence of the forest with a song of his own. Between one breath and the next, the legend was complete. He was no longer the runt, the ghost, or the monster. Before he could move, the memory faded, leaving him in absolute, terrifying stillness. He was the all-is-lost moment personified. As the silence stretched, he looked into the darkness of his own soul and saw nothing but a mirror of the abyss he had fallen into. In the span of a breath, the last of his hope flickered out. He was no longer a bridge, he was a broken link. He closed his eyes and waited for the light of the coronation to burn him away. The act ended with Kaelen in utter despair, his internal flaw, the belief that he was inherently worthless, finally consuming the power he had worked so hard to gain. Chapter 19. The Anchor. The darkness of the hovel wasn't just a place anymore. It was a mirror. Kaelen sat in the filth, staring at his fading hands, until the silence of the room began to vibrate with a new frequency. It wasn't the cold hunger of the deities, nor was it the jagged heat of Fenris's gold. Instead, it was a low, steady thrum, the memory of Lyra's hand on his scarred wrist. In that moment, Kaelen realized he hadn't lost his power. He had simply been trying to fuel a cosmic vacuum with petty hatred. "I didn't survive the ridge to be a shadow of Fenris," he whispered, his voice cracking the stillness. As the truth unraveled, his perspective shifted. He wasn't a nothing because he was worthless. He was a nothing because he was the only thing capable of holding the world's pain without breaking. Because of that, the gray hue of his skin began to deepen into a rich, terrifying obsidian. Not only that, but his heart, which had been silent, gave a single tectonic pulse of void energy. "She is my anchor," Kaelen realized, his eyes snapping open to reveal twin pools of endless violet. Suddenly, the solar noise from the high seat above didn't hurt anymore. Rather, it became a roadmap. He could feel the void where Lyra was being held, a cold spot in the feverish heat of the palace. With every heartbeat he now chose to have, the shadows in the room began to stabilize, weaving themselves into a sleek, armored second skin. He stood up, and as the wind shifted through the cracks in the stone, Kaelen felt the liturgy of the void return to him. Not as a weapon of revenge, but as a tool of liberation. Chapter 20. The Masked Envoy. The coronation feast was a riot of excess, a sea of golden fur and drunken laughter that spilled out of the great hall. Still, a sudden chill swept through the room as a figure emerged from the main archway. He was tall, draped in robes of shifting smoke, his face hidden behind a mask of solidified shadow that looked like a skull carved from the night sky. The music faltered, and even the Alpha's elite guards stepped back, their instincts screaming that something wrong had just entered the light. "Who goes there?" Jax barked, his hand going to the hilt of his sun-etched blade. Kaelen didn't answer with words. Instead, he walked forward with a predatory intensity that made the torches flicker and die as he passed. He was acting as the masked envoy of the Void Wastes, a role the deities had whispered to him in the dark. To make things worse for the guards, every step he took seemed to delete the sound of the flutes and the chatter, leaving a wake of absolute silence behind him. "I am the reminder," Kaelen's voice echoed, sounding like a landslide in a deep canyon. He walked directly past Fenris, who was sitting on the high seat with a crown of woven gold upon his brow. For a second, the two men were inches apart. The moment their eyes locked, or rather, the moment Fenris stared into the violet abyss of the mask, the golden sun felt a bone-deep chill that no solar flare could warm. Yet Fenris was too arrogant to see the runt behind the god. He merely sneered, thinking this was some dark diplomat sent to pay him homage. "Sit and witness our glory, Shadow Man," Fenris declared, his voice booming with artificial confidence. Kaelen bowed his head, a gesture of mockery that went unnoticed by the drunken throng. What followed was a strategic retreat into the periphery of the hall. He had successfully infiltrated the lion's den, and as the silence stretched, he began to pulse his power into the floorboards. He was mapping the stones, feeling for the iron bars that held his partner in the dark. Chapter 21. The Phasing Deep. Beneath the floor of the great hall, the air in the defect pen was thin and acrid. Lyra sat chained to a pillar of cold iron, her white hair matted with blood and dust. Without warning, the shadows in the corner of her cell began to swirl and thicken. In the span of a breath, Kaelen stepped out of the wall itself, his mask dissolving into smoke to reveal his face. "Kaelen?" she gasped, her voice a mere thread of sound. "Hush," he whispered, the syllable rippling through the room. Before the words left his lips, he reached for her chains. He didn't use a key or brute strength. Instead, he spoke the second syllable of the liturgy. Null. Just like that, the iron bars and the silver shackles didn't break. They simply ceased to be. They vanished into fine gray mist, leaving Lyra to fall forward into his arms. He caught her, savoring the solid, real presence of the only person who truly knew him. "You came back," she murmured, her soul answering the cold pulse of his chest. "I never left," Kaelen replied, his voice firming with a new protective resolve. "The coronation has begun, Lyra. It's time to show them that the sun has a shadow." Not only that, but Kaelen felt the bond between them pulse, a connection that was neither solar nor lunar, but something entirely new. It was a bridge of void light that made them stronger together than they ever were apart. As the horn sounded from the hall above, signaling the start of the final ritual, the tension broke. They weren't just two runts escaping a cage. They were the beginning of the end. "Are you ready?" Lyra asked, her sightless eyes glowing with a reflected violet fire. Kaelen put his mask back on, the solidified shadow clicking into place. "Let them have their feast," he said, his voice echoing with finality. "The dessert is going to be very, very cold." Chapter 22. The Climax. The high seat was bathed in a blinding artificial noon. Fenris stood atop the altar of purity, his arms raised as the solar flare began to descend from the sky like a liquid gold waterfall. Thousands of silver-fang wolves bowed, their howls merging into a deafening wall of sound that shook the very mountain. "Witness the dawn of the eternal Alpha," the high priest shrieked. But then, the light didn't touch Fenris. Instead, it hit a wall of absolute, terrifying nothingness. A figure in a mask of solidified smoke stepped onto the altar. The silence roared as Kaelen reached up and shattered the shadow mask with his bare, blackened fingers. "Kaelen," Fenris gasped, his golden eyes wide with a terror he hadn't felt since the ridge. The pack froze, the air turning to ice in the span of a breath as the broken Omega stared down the god they had built. "You wanted a sacrifice, Fenris," Kaelen said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 fallen stars. "I've come to give you the truth." Without warning, Fenris lunged, his fists erupting with solar fire that burned white hot. Kaelen didn't move. He didn't shift. He simply stood there, and as the fire touched his skin, it didn't burn. It was inhaled. Kalen's chest expanded, his violet veins pulsing with the stolen heat of the sun. Before the words left his lips, he spoke the final syllable of the liturgy. "Hush." Just like that, the sun went dark. The solar flare vanished, snuffed out like a candle in a vacuum. Fenris fell to his knees, his golden fur turning a dull, pathetic gray as his borrowed power was deleted from his blood. The pack watched in horror as their god scrambled in the dirt, a man with no light and no bite. He was Kaelen Thorne, and for the first time in 20 years, he was exactly where he was meant to be.